The hotel suite door closed behind them with a soft click that echoed like thunder in the charged silence. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs as she turned to face Kang Min-ho, the man who'd spent the entire evening watching her with eyes that promised everything and demanded more. His jaw was tight, his hands flexed at his sides, and when he spoke, his voice was rough silk over steel. "You don't know what you're asking for." But she did. After a year of longing glances and stolen moments, after tonight when he'd defended her honor with violence barely leashed, after he'd whispered against her ear that he couldn't pretend anymore, she knew exactly what she wanted. Him. All of him. The consequences be damned. Welcome to Afrokorean Stories, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. 24 hours earlier, Naomi had been laughing with her coworkers at the marketing firm where she'd worked for 3 years, celebrating her 26th birthday with cake and champagne in the break room. She'd worn her favorite dress, the emerald one that hugged her curves and made her feel beautiful despite the whispers she sometimes heard about how different she looked in Seoul's predominantly homogeneous corporate world. Her best friend Hannah had organized everything, even getting their notoriously cold CEO to attend for 5 minutes of obligatory pleasantries. Except Kang Min-ho never did anything obligatory. When he'd walked into that break room, his presence had sucked the oxygen from the space. Every conversation had stuttered to a halt. He was 32, devastatingly handsome in the way Korean dramas tried to capture but never quite achieved, with sharp features that could have been carved from marble and eyes that saw too much. He ran one of Seoul's most successful venture capital firms by day. What he did by night, the rumors suggested, was far more dangerous. He'd approached her directly while everyone watched, ignoring the elaborate cake and champagne tower to focus entirely on her. "Miss Williams. Happy birthday." His English had been perfect, accented but precise. She'd managed to thank him, acutely aware of how her skin flushed darker under his scrutiny, how her breath caught when his gaze dropped briefly to her mouth before returning to her eyes. "I trust you're enjoying your celebration," he'd continued, and something in his tone made it sound like he was asking about far more than cake and cheap champagne. Before she could respond, Hannah had interrupted with birthday toasts and photo requests, and Min-ho had stepped back, retreating to his executive floor. But not before catching her eye one last time with a look that made her stomach flip. The rest of the afternoon had passed in a blur of congratulations and gossip. Her coworkers had whispered about how the CEO had never attended anyone else's birthday celebration, how he'd looked at her, what it might mean. Naomi had tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but her heart hadn't believed the lie. Kang Min-ho had been watching her for months. She'd felt his eyes during presentations, caught him staring during meetings, noticed how he always seemed to know where she was in the building. It should have been creepy. Instead, it made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced before. That evening, Hannah had insisted on taking her out to Gangnam's most exclusive club to continue the celebration. "You only turn 26 once," her friend had declared, dragging her into a dress even tighter than the one she'd worn to work. The club had been everything Seoul nightlife promised, all glittering lights and expensive bottles and beautiful people dancing like tomorrow didn't exist. Naomi had tried to lose herself in the music, to forget the intensity of Min-ho's gaze earlier, to pretend her skin didn't still tingle from the brief moment their hands had touched when he'd handed her a gift, a small box she hadn't yet opened. She'd been on the dance floor, surrounded by strangers, when she'd felt it. That unmistakable sensation of being watched. She'd turned, scanning the crowd, and found him. Kang Min-ho stood in the VIP section above the main floor, partially hidden in shadows but unmistakable. He wasn't dancing. Wasn't drinking. Just watching her with an intensity that should have been illegal. Their eyes had locked across the distance and chaos, and Naomi had forgotten how to breathe. The music had faded to white noise. The crowd had disappeared. There was only him and the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the entire city. Then someone had touched her waist. A man she didn't know, trying to dance with her, his hands too familiar, his breath reeking of soju. She'd tried to step away politely, but he'd grabbed her wrist, pulling her back with a laugh that made her skin crawl. "Come on, beautiful. Don't be shy. She'd been about to make a scene when a hand had closed around the man's wrist with enough force to make him yelp. She's not interested. Minho's voice had been deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that made smart people run. The drunk man had been too stupid or too intoxicated to understand. Who the hell are you? Her boyfriend? He'd sneered at Minho, looking him up and down dismissively. The change in Minho had been terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. His jaw had clenched, his eyes had gone flat and cold, and when he'd spoken again, his voice had carried enough menace to make the people nearby back away instinctively. I'm the man who's going to break your hand if you don't let her go in the next 3 seconds. The drunk had released her immediately, stumbling backward, suddenly sober enough to recognize danger when it was promising him violence. Minho had turned to her then, his expression shifting from lethal to concerned in a heartbeat. Are you all right? She'd nodded, her voice lost somewhere between fear and something far more dangerous. He'd taken her hand, not asking permission, just threading his fingers through hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. Come with me. Please. He'd led her away from the dance floor, through the crowd that parted for him like he was royalty, upstairs she hadn't known existed to a private room that overlooked the entire club. The door had closed behind them, muffling the music to a distant pulse, and they'd been alone. Truly alone for the first time since this thing between them had started, whatever this thing was. I shouldn't be here, she'd said, but she hadn't pulled her hand from his. I know. He hadn't released her either. They'd stood there in the dim light, connected by their clasped hands and something far more profound, something that felt like gravity and fate and terrible timing all at once. Why did you come tonight? She'd asked, finding her voice. To the club. You knew I'd be here. He'd looked at her for a long moment before answering, and when he had, the raw honesty in his words had stolen her breath. Because I can't seem to stay away from you, no matter how much I know I should. The confession had hung between them, too big and too true to take back. Naomi had felt her heart hammering, felt the heat of his body close to hers, felt every rational reason to walk away crumbling under the weight of what she wanted. Why should you stay away? She'd whispered. His laugh had been bitter, beautiful. Because you work for me. Because I'm your boss. Because I'm involved in things you shouldn't be anywhere near. Because you deserve better than what I can offer you. What if I don't want better? The words had come out before she could stop them, brave and reckless and completely honest. What if I want you? Something had broken in his eyes then, control shattering like glass. He'd pulled her closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about him. Naomi. Her name on his lips had sounded like a prayer and a curse. If I kiss you right now, I won't be able to stop. I won't be able to pretend this isn't happening anymore. Everything changes. She'd leaned into his touch, her decision made the moment he'd defended her on the dance floor, maybe even months before when she'd first felt his eyes on her during a presentation and something had shifted in her chest. Then kiss me and let everything change. He had. The kiss had started gentle, almost reverent, like he was giving her one last chance to change her mind. But when she'd pressed closer, her hands fisting in his shirt, the gentleness had given way to something desperate and consuming. He'd kissed her like he'd been starving for it, like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning, like every minute he'd spent watching her and wanting her had built to this moment. She'd kissed him back with equal fervor, years of feeling invisible in this city, in this culture, melting away under his touch. He made her feel wanted. He made her feel seen. He made her feel like the most important person in his entire world. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, he'd rested his forehead against hers. Come home with me. Not because I'm your boss. Not because of anything except this. His thumb had traced her lower lip, making her shiver. Stay with me tonight. Let me show you everything I've been feeling. She'd said yes without hesitation, without thought for consequences or company policies or the whispers that would follow. She'd said yes because saying no felt impossible, because walking away from this feeling felt like walking away from something vital. He'd taken her to his penthouse in Gangnam, a space that screamed wealth and power and carefully curated taste. But she'd barely noticed the view or the art or the expense of everything because his attention had been entirely on her from the moment they'd crossed the threshold. "Are you sure?" he'd asked one final time, giving her an out even though she could see the strain it cost him. "I'm sure," she'd answered, and that had been all the permission he'd needed. The night that had followed had been everything and more than she'd imagined during those long months of tension and longing. He'd been attentive and demanding in equal measure, learning every response, every sound, every place that made her gasp his name. He'd worshipped her curves like they were art, kissed scars she'd always hidden, made her feel beautiful in ways no one ever had. The connection between them had been more than physical, something deeper and more profound that she hadn't known was possible. When exhaustion had finally claimed them both, she'd fallen asleep in his arms feeling complete. But morning had brought doubt and fear in equal measure. She'd woken before him, watching him sleep in the early light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, and reality had crashed over her like ice water. She was sleeping with her boss. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. What would happen now at work? Would he regret this? Would he think less of her? Would this beautiful night become an office scandal? The questions had spiraled until she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't stay. She'd dressed quietly, careful not to wake him, and left before he could open his eyes and tell her it had been a mistake. She'd gone home to her small apartment in Itaewon, the place she'd rented when she'd first moved to Seoul 3 years ago to teach English and had stayed after landing the marketing job. She'd showered, changed, tried to wash away the feeling of his hands on her skin, his breath against her neck, his voice saying her name like it was sacred. It hadn't worked. Nothing had worked except crawling into bed and trying to convince herself she'd done the right thing by leaving. Her phone had started ringing around noon. Minho. She'd stared at his name on the screen, thumb hovering over the answer button, before ultimately letting it go to voicemail. The voicemail he'd left had been short, his voice carefully controlled. "Naomi. Call me back. Please." She hadn't. She'd let the phone ring 3 more times before finally turning it off completely, telling herself she needed space to think, to process, to figure out what came next. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. She was scared. Scared of what she felt. Scared of how much she wanted him. Scared that last night had meant everything to her and nothing to him. By evening, she'd convinced herself that avoiding him was the right strategy, that if she just gave it a few days, they could both move past this and pretend it never happened. She'd been wrong. The knock on her door had come at 8 o'clock, firm and insistent and impossible to ignore. She'd known who it was before opening it, had felt his presence through the door the same way she always felt him in a room, that magnetic pull she couldn't explain or resist. When she'd finally opened the door, he'd been standing there still in his clothes from the night before, looking like he hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed and wild. "Why did you leave?" His voice had been rough, raw with emotion he wasn't trying to hide. She'd opened her mouth to make an excuse, to lie, to protect herself, but the words had died under his gaze. "I was scared," she'd admitted instead. "Of me? Of what happened?" He'd stepped closer, and she'd let him, unable to do anything else. "Of what it meant. Of what comes next. Of you regretting it and me being the stupid girl who slept with her boss and ruined everything." The confession had spilled out in a rush, all her fears laid bare. His expression had shifted from anger to something softer, something that looked almost like pain. "You think I regret last night? You think that's why you had to sneak out before I woke up?" He'd reached for her hand, holding it between both of his. "Naomi, I'd been half in love with you since the first time you presented in that conference room 6 months ago and argued with the finance director about budget allocation. I've been completely in love with you since you stayed late 3 months ago to help the intern finish a project even though it wasn't your responsibility. Last night wasn't a mistake. It was the only real thing I've felt in years." The words had hit her like a physical force, beautiful and terrifying and too much all at once. "You love me?" Her voice had been barely a whisper. I'm obsessed with you, he'd corrected, pulling her closer. I think about you constantly. I know your coffee order, your favorite lunch spot, the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating. I know you're scared of disappointing people, that you work twice as hard as anyone else because you feel like you have to prove yourself, that you hide how homesick you get sometimes because you don't want people to think you can't handle it. He'd cupped her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. I know you, Naomi. And knowing you made me love you. Last night just made it official. She'd started crying then, overwhelmed by the honesty, by the vulnerability in his admission, by the fact that he saw her, really saw her, in ways she hadn't known were possible. I'm scared, she'd admitted again. I'm scared of losing my job, of people thinking I slept my way to success, of this being too good to be true. He'd kissed her forehead, gentle and reassuring. Then quit. She'd pulled back to stare at him. What? Quit the company. I'll help you find something better, somewhere you'll be appreciated for your talent instead of questioned because of me. Or keep working there and let me deal with anyone who has a problem. I don't care what you choose as long as you choose to be with me. You're serious. It hadn't been a question. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. He'd pulled her fully into his arms, and she'd gone willingly, burying her face in his chest. I want you, Naomi. Not just for last night. Not just for sex or company or convenience. I want all of you. The woman who argues about budgets and stays late to help interns and makes me laugh during boring meetings. I want to wake up next to you and know you're not going to disappear. I want to introduce you to my family and take you to events and let everyone know you're mine. If you'll have me. The tears had come harder then, relief and joy and overwhelming emotion flooding through her. Yes, she'd managed between sobs. Yes, I'll have you. I want all of that too. He pulled back just enough to kiss her properly, deep and claiming and full of promise. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing hard, he'd smiled. Really smiled, not the careful corporate expression but something genuine and beautiful. Good. Because I'm not letting you go. Ever. They'd talked through the night, making plans and promises and declarations that would have seemed insane if they hadn't felt so absolutely right. She'd stay at the company for now, but they'd be open about their relationship, letting HR and the board know so there were no secrets, no scandals, no ammunition for anyone who might want to cause problems. He'd made it clear that anyone who had an issue with them being together could take it up with him directly, and given his reputation, she hadn't doubted that would be the end of any complaints. The following week, they'd made their relationship official. There had been whispers, of course, sideways glances and barely concealed gossip in the break room. But Minho had handled it with characteristic efficiency, calling an all-staff meeting to announce their relationship and making it clear that Naomi's position was based entirely on merit and anyone who suggested otherwise would be looking for new employment. The gossip had died quickly after that, replaced by wary acceptance and, surprisingly, a few genuine congratulations from colleagues who'd seen how hard she worked. Life had fallen into a new rhythm after that. She'd moved into his penthouse within a month, unable to stand being apart from him for more than necessary. Her small Itaewon apartment had been sublet to another expatriate, her meager possessions absorbed into his space until it felt like their space. They'd fallen into domestic routines that felt impossibly normal considering how intense everything between them was. Morning coffee together before work, evening dinners where they talked about everything and nothing, weekends spent exploring the city or staying in bed until noon. But underneath the domesticity, there had always been an edge. Minho had been honest about his business interests, about the fact that his venture capital firm was legitimate but funded in part by investments from less savory sources. He'd had connections to organizations that operated in gray areas, dealt with people who solved problems through intimidation rather than negotiation. He'd promised her she'd never be directly involved in that side of his life, but he'd also been clear that it existed, that it was part of who he was and how he'd built his empire. She'd struggled with that knowledge at first, with reconciling the gentle man who made her breakfast with the dangerous one who could make people disappear with a phone call. But she'd also seen how he protected the people he cared about, how loyal he was to his employees and family, how he used his power to help rather than harm whenever possible. She'd chosen to focus on that, on the man she knew rather than the reputation that preceded him. Their relationship had deepened over the following months, growing from intense attraction into something more profound. He'd been attentive and affectionate in ways that surprised her, given his cold public persona. He'd remembered every small detail she mentioned, from her favorite flower to the name of her childhood dog. He'd learned to cook Nigerian food from YouTube videos so she'd have taste of home. He'd defended her to his traditional family when they'd expressed concern about him dating a foreigner, making it clear she was non-negotiable. She'd fallen more in love with him every day, with his contradictions and his intensity and the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. She'd learned his tells, the way his jaw clenched when he was angry, how his eyes softened when he was proud of her, the slight smile that meant he was planning something. She'd learned to read his moods and his silences, to push when he needed it and give space when he was dealing with the darker aspects of his business. By the time her 27th birthday approached, they'd been together for a year. A year that had transformed her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. She'd been promoted twice, her work finally receiving the recognition it deserved without whispers about favoritism. She'd made Seoul feel like home rather than temporary exile. She'd found family in Minho and his tight circle of trusted people. She'd found herself in ways she hadn't known she'd been lost. The party he'd thrown for her birthday had been extravagant and intimate at once, just close friends and his inner circle at an exclusive restaurant he'd rented out completely. There had been champagne and laughter and toasts that made her cry happy tears. His best friend and second-in-command, Jae-sung, had embarrassed them both with stories about Minho's descent into obvious lovesickness over the past year. Hannah had made a speech about how happy Naomi seemed, how right they were together despite all the reasons it shouldn't have worked. Minho had been attentive all evening, keeping her close, his hand always finding hers or the small of her back, his attention never straying even when business associates tried to pull him into conversation. He'd made her feel like the center of his universe, which she'd learned over the year was exactly how he always made her feel. When he'd presented her gift, a delicate necklace with a pendant that held both their birthstones, she'd kissed him in front of everyone, too full of emotion to care about public displays. The party had wound down around midnight, guests departing with warm wishes and knowing smiles. Minho had arranged for a car to take Hannah home safely, had ensured everyone else had transportation, had handled every detail with his characteristic efficiency. Then he'd turned to her, his eyes dark with promise. "Ready to go home?" She'd nodded, but something had stirred in her chest, bold and reckless. They'd been together a year. She knew him. She trusted him. She wanted him. Not just the gentle intimacy they'd shared, but something more, something deeper. She wanted all of him. In the car ride back to the penthouse, she'd worked up her courage, her heart pounding as she'd decided to ask for what she wanted. They'd had a beautiful evening. He'd given her the world for her birthday. And she wanted to give him something in return, wanted to show him how much she trusted him, how completely she was his. When they'd reached the penthouse and he'd started to lead her inside, she'd stopped him, her hand on his chest. "Minho. I want to ask you something." He'd looked down at her, concerned. "Anything. You know that." She'd taken a breath, feeling her cheeks heat even after a year together. "I want you. Tonight. All of you. No holding back." Understanding had dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by desire so intense it made her breath catch. "Naomi." Her name had been a warning and a question. "Are you sure? Because once we start down that path, once I stop holding back, I won't be able to pretend I'm not completely consumed by you." She'd smiled, brave and certain. "I don't want you to pretend. I want you exactly as you are. I'm asking you. Please." That was how they'd ended up here, in his bedroom with the door closed and the city glittering below them through massive windows. How she'd ended up making this request that she knew would change everything between them again, deeper this time, more permanent. He'd been holding back for a year, being gentle when she knew he wanted to be possessive, being careful when she knew he wanted to claim her completely. Tonight, she didn't want careful. Tonight, she wanted everything. He'd closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands framing her face as he kissed her with barely restrained hunger. "I love you," he'd said against her lips. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." She'd kissed him back, pouring a year of trust and devotion into the contact. "Show me. Show me how much." And he had, with a passion and intensity that made their first night together seem tame by comparison, with possessive touches and whispered promises and complete vulnerability on both sides. Hours later, they lay tangled together in his bed, the sheets a mess around them, both breathing hard and sated in ways that went beyond physical. Minho traced patterns on her shoulder, his touch gentle now, reverent. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair. She turned to look at him, confused. "For what?" "For trusting me with all of you. For asking for what you wanted. For being brave enough to let me love you the way I've been desperate to." She'd kissed him softly, her heart full to bursting. "Thank you for waiting. For being patient. For making me feel safe enough to ask." They'd drifted off to sleep wrapped around each other, peaceful and complete. But peace never lasted long in Minho's world. She'd learned that over the year, learned that danger lurked at the edges of the life he'd built, that enemies waited for weaknesses to exploit. She'd learned to be careful, to let his security team accompany her places, to understand that his protectiveness came from real threats rather than paranoia. What she hadn't learned yet was just how far those enemies would go. The next morning had started normally enough. They'd woken tangled together, made love again in the early light, shared coffee and easy conversation over breakfast. He'd had meetings scheduled, and she'd planned to work from home on a presentation due the following week. He'd kissed her goodbye at the door, long and thorough, making her laugh when he'd clearly been reluctant to leave. "I'll be back by dinner," he'd promised. "We'll order from that place you like." She'd watched him go, unaware that by dinner, their entire world would be on fire. The day had passed quietly. She'd worked on her presentation, answered emails, done laundry with music playing through the penthouse. Around 3 in the afternoon, she'd decided to run out for groceries, wanting to cook something special for dinner rather than ordering in. She'd texted Minho's head of security, Jin Woo, who'd insisted on sending someone with her. She'd accepted gracefully, having learned not to fight about security measures. The driver, Young Soo, had taken her to the market she preferred in Gangnam, the one with the international section where she could find ingredients that reminded her of home. She'd been browsing the produce section, Young Soo waiting patiently nearby, when her phone had rung. Unknown number. She'd almost ignored it, but something had made her answer. "Hello?" The voice on the other end had been male, Korean, unfamiliar. "Miss Williams. You don't know me, but I know you very well. You should leave the market. Now." Then the line had gone dead. She'd stood frozen, her heart starting to race, instinct screaming danger even though she couldn't name the source. She'd turned to find Young Soo, to tell him about the call, when the explosion had ripped through the front of the market. The force had knocked her off her feet, throwing her into a shelf of canned goods. Her ears had rung, smoke filling her lungs, screams echoing around her. She'd scrambled up, disoriented and terrified, searching through the chaos for Young Soo. She'd found him near the entrance, blood streaming from a head wound but conscious. He'd grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back exit even as his other hand pressed against his phone, calling for backup, calling for Minho. They'd made it outside into an alley, and she'd been about to ask if he was okay when the van had appeared, blocking their escape. Men had poured out, masked and armed, and Young Soo had pushed her behind him, drawing his own weapon. But there had been too many, and he'd been injured, and within seconds they'd overwhelmed him. Someone had grabbed her, a cloth pressed over her mouth and nose, chemical smell making her head spin. She'd fought, thrashing and screaming, but her vision had gone dark at the edges, her limbs going heavy. The last thing she'd heard before consciousness fled was Young Soo shouting into his phone, telling someone to protect Minho, that this was a trap, an ambush designed to draw him out. She'd woken in darkness, her head pounding, her mouth dry, zip ties cutting into her wrists. She'd been in some kind of warehouse, she'd realized as her eyes adjusted, industrial and abandoned, the kind of place where screams wouldn't carry. Terror had flooded through her, sharp and acidic, but she'd forced it down, forced herself to think. Minho would come for her. She knew that with absolute certainty. He would tear Seoul apart to find her. She just had to survive until he did. Footsteps had approached, and lights had flickered on, harsh and blinding. She'd squinted against them, trying to see who'd taken her and why. A man had emerged from the shadows, middle-aged and well-dressed, looking completely out of place in the grimy warehouse. "Miss Williams. I apologize for the dramatic extraction. I needed to ensure Kong Minho's full attention." His English had been perfect, educated. She'd swallowed her fear and met his eyes. "Who are you? What do you want?" He'd smiled, cold and calculating. "My name is Choi Sung-hwan. I'm a businessman, like Minho. We've had certain disagreements about territory and operations. He's been cutting into my interests, you see. Making things difficult for me and my associates." Understanding had dawned, cold and terrible. "So you took me to hurt him." "I took you to motivate him," Sung-hwan had corrected. "There are things I need him to agree to, territories I need him to cede, arrangements I need him to accept. He's been stubbornly resistant to negotiation. But now he has something to lose. Something precious." His smile had widened. "You, Miss Williams, are leverage. Nothing more, nothing less. If he cooperates, you go home unharmed. If he doesn't." He'd trailed off meaningfully. She'd lifted her chin, refusing to show weakness. "He'll never negotiate with you. He'll find me and destroy you." Sung-hwan had laughed, genuinely amused. "Probably. Minho is nothing if not predictable when it comes to protecting what's his. But that's what I'm counting on. His rage will make him reckless. Reckless men make mistakes. And mistakes create opportunities." He'd turned to leave, gesturing to the guards stationed around the space. "Make yourself comfortable, Miss Williams. You'll be here until your boyfriend decides how much you're worth to him." The hours that had followed had been the longest of her life. She'd been left alone in the cold warehouse, her mind racing with fear and fury in equal measure. She'd tested her restraints, searching for weaknesses, but the zip ties had been secure and the guards had been vigilant. She'd tried to keep track of time, but without windows or a clock, she'd quickly lost count. All she'd known was that somewhere out there, Minho was looking for her, and when he found her, there would be hell to pay. She hadn't been wrong. The rescue had come sooner than Sung-hwan had probably expected, a testament to Minho's resources and determination. She'd heard the gunfire first, sharp cracks echoing through the warehouse, making the guards scramble into defensive positions. Then she'd heard him, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Where is she?" The words had been deadly quiet, but they'd carried enough menace to make one of the guards actually whimper. The door to her section of the warehouse had crashed open, and he'd been there, dressed all in black, a gun in his hand and death in his eyes. He'd seen her, and for a moment something terrible and beautiful had crossed his face, relief and rage and love all twisted together. Then he'd turned that fury on the remaining guards, and what had followed had been brutal and efficient. She'd closed her eyes, unable to watch but hearing everything, the sounds of violence that would probably haunt her dreams. When silence had finally fallen, she'd opened her eyes to find him in front of her, his hands gentle as they'd cut through the zip ties, his voice soft despite the steel underneath. "I've got you. You're safe. I've got you." She'd collapsed against him, shaking with relief and delayed shock, and he'd held her like she was made of glass and gold. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry. This should never have happened. I should have protected you better." She'd pulled back to look at him, seeing the guilt and anguish in his eyes. "This isn't your fault. You didn't take me. But they took you because of me," he'd countered, his jaw clenched. Because being with me makes you a target. Because loving me puts you in danger. She'd cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. I chose you knowing the risks. I chose you anyway. So did you save me? He'd nodded, something fierce and possessive flashing in his gaze. Always. I will always save you. The aftermath had been complicated. Police had been involved, though Minho's connections had ensured certain details remained vague. Sung Hwan had been arrested, his operation dismantled, his associates scattered or eliminated. Minho had made sure of it, calling in every favor, using every resource, ensuring that anyone who'd been involved in her kidnapping would never threaten them again. But the trauma had lingered for both of them. She'd had nightmares for weeks, waking in terror until his arms around her convinced her she was safe. He'd become even more protective, if that was possible, barely letting her out of his sight, tripling security, making changes to their life that prioritized her safety above everything else. 2 months after the kidnapping, she'd woken to find him sitting on the edge of their bed, watching her sleep with an expression she couldn't quite read. Minho? What's wrong? He'd been quiet for a long moment before speaking. I can't do this anymore. Her heart had stopped. Can't do what? Can't pretend that having you in my life isn't the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. He'd turned to face her fully. Every time you leave the house, I'm afraid someone will take you again. Every time my phone rings, I'm terrified it's bad news. Every moment you're not in my sight, I'm imagining 1,000 ways I could lose you. She'd sat up, reaching for his hand. So what are you saying? That you want me to leave? That being together isn't worth the risk? No. The word had been immediate, fierce. I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying I need you to marry me. I need you to be my wife officially, legally, in every way that matters. I need everyone in this city, this country, this world to know that you're mine and that touching you means death. He'd pulled out a ring, the diamond catching the early morning light. Marry me, Naomi. Not because you have to, not because of fear or obligation or anything except the fact that I love you more than anything and I need you by my side forever. She'd stared at him, at the ring, at the vulnerability and desperation in his eyes, and her answer had been immediate. Yes. 1,000 times yes. She'd launched herself at him, kissing him through tears of joy and relief. I love you. I want to marry you. I want everything with you, danger and all. He'd slipped the ring onto her finger, and it had fit perfectly, just like everything between them. They'd made love that morning with a new intensity, sealing their promise, and afterward he'd held her close and told her about the plans he'd already made. I want to get married soon, he'd said. As soon as possible. I don't want to wait. She'd laughed against his chest. Eager much? Terrified, he'd corrected honestly. Terrified of losing you. Terrified that something will happen before I can make you mine in every way that counts. I've already spoken to my family. They're ready whenever we are. She'd pulled back to look at him. Your mother agreed? She's always been hesitant about us. He'd smiled. She agreed when I told her that I'd marry you with or without her blessing, but I'd prefer to have it. She realized I was serious and came around quickly. Turns out almost losing you made her realize how much you mean to our family. The wedding had been planned with the same efficiency Minho brought to everything in his life. 3 weeks later, she'd stood in a traditional hanbok that had been specially made for her, the colors chosen to complement her skin tone beautifully. The ceremony had blended Korean and Nigerian traditions, honoring both their cultures in ways that made her cry happy tears. Hannah had been her maid of honor, Jae-sung had stood as Minho's best man, and when they'd exchanged vows, there hadn't been a dry eye in the room. I promise to protect you, Minho had said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. To cherish you, to choose you every day for the rest of my life. You made me believe in love again. You made me believe I could be more than what I was raised to be. I will spend forever being worthy of that gift. She'd squeezed his hands, her own vows spilling out from her heart. I promise to stand beside you through everything. To trust you, to challenge you, to love every part of you including the parts that scare other people. You showed me what it means to be truly seen. I will spend forever seeing you just as clearly. The reception had been a blur of joy and celebration, friends and family toasting their future, music and dancing and laughter that echoed through the venue. But the moment she remembered most clearly was when Minho had pulled her onto the dance floor for their first dance as husband and wife. He'd held her close, his lips against her ear. You're mine now. Officially, legally, completely mine. She'd smiled against his shoulder. I've been yours since the moment you kissed me in that club. This just makes it official. He'd tightened his arms around her. I'm never letting you go. You know that, right? For the rest of our lives, you're stuck with me. Good, she'd whispered back. Because I'm never leaving. The honeymoon had been 2 weeks in Bali, sun and privacy and complete disconnection from Seoul's chaos. They'd made love on private beaches, explored temples and markets, talked about their future and the family they wanted to build. He'd been relaxed in ways she rarely saw, the constant tension in his shoulders finally easing, and she'd fallen even more in love with this version of him, the man who existed when the armor came off. They'd returned to Seoul refreshed and more in love than ever, ready to start their married life together. Minho had insisted she quit the company, not because he didn't value her work but because he wanted to remove any complications, any whispers about favoritism or impropriety. She'd agreed, ready for a new challenge anyway, and within a month she'd landed a position at a competing firm where her skills were valued and her relationship to Minho was irrelevant to her success. Life had settled into a new rhythm. She'd thrown herself into her new job, proving herself all over again, earning respect through results rather than connections. He'd continued running his empire with ruthless efficiency, but now he came home to her every night, and that made everything else bearable. They'd talked about children, about expanding their family, but they'd agreed to wait a year, to enjoy being newlyweds before adding that complexity. Fate, however, had other plans. 4 months after their wedding, she'd woken feeling nauseated and exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with her workload. She'd brushed it off as stress or maybe food poisoning, but when the symptoms had persisted for a week, Hannah had dragged her to a pharmacy for a pregnancy test. The positive result had stared up at her from the counter, undeniable and terrifying and thrilling all at once. She'd stared at it for a long time, her hand unconsciously moving to her still flat stomach, trying to process the reality of a life growing inside her. Minho's child. Their child. They hadn't planned this yet, but somehow it felt absolutely right. She'd called him immediately, unable to wait until he got home to share the news. Can you come home early? She'd asked, her voice shaking with emotion. He'd heard it immediately. Are you okay? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. I just need you here. Please. He'd arrived within 30 minutes, finding her sitting on their bed with the test clutched in her hands. Naomi, what? He'd stopped when he'd seen what she was holding, his eyes going wide. Is that? Positive, she'd confirmed, watching his face carefully for his reaction. We're having a baby. I know we weren't planning this yet, and if you're not ready, we can discuss options, but I want you to know that I'm happy about this, scared but happy, and I hope you are too. He'd crossed to her in 2 strides, dropping to his knees in front of her, his hands covering hers around the test. You're pregnant. We're having a baby. His voice had been full of wonder and something that might have been tears. She'd nodded, her own tears starting to fall. Are you happy? Tell me you're happy. He'd pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. I'm terrified and overwhelmed and happier than I've ever been in my entire life. We're having a baby. You're giving me a family. How could I be anything but grateful? The pregnancy had transformed him in unexpected ways. He'd been protective before, but now he'd been almost comically vigilant, monitoring her diet and sleep and stress levels like a hawk. He'd attended every doctor's appointment, asked a million questions, read every book on pregnancy and parenting he could find. He'd hired additional security, baby-proofed the penthouse months before necessary, and generally driven her slightly insane with his hovering. But she'd loved him for it, for the way he cared, for the way he already loved their child. Her pregnancy had been relatively smooth, just the usual discomforts and occasional complications that her doctor had assured them were normal. Minho had been there through all of it, holding her hair when morning sickness struck, rubbing her feet when they swelled, reading to her belly when insomnia kept her awake. He'd talked to their child constantly, telling them about the world they'd be born into, the family waiting to meet them, the love that already surrounded them. They'd decided not to find out the gender, wanting it to be a surprise. They'd prepared for both possibilities, decorating a nursery in neutral colors, choosing names that would work for either. Minho had wanted something that honored both their cultures, and they'd spent hours discussing options before finally agreeing on names they both loved. Her water had broken 3 weeks before her due date, in the middle of the night, and Minho had gone into crisis management mode. He'd grabbed the hospital bag they'd had packed for weeks, called her doctor, arranged for security to meet them at the hospital, and gotten her into the car in under 5 minutes. The labor had been long and difficult, 18 hours of pain and exhaustion that had tested every limit she had. Minho had stayed by her side through all of it, holding her hand, coaching her breathing, murmuring encouragement even when she'd screamed at him that this was his fault. He'd never flinched, never left, just stayed steady and solid beside her until finally, their daughter had made her entrance into the world. The moment the doctor had placed their baby in her arms, everything else had faded away. She'd stared down at the tiny face, the shock of dark hair, the perfect features that somehow combined both their genetics into something entirely new and beautiful. "She's perfect," she'd whispered, unable to look away. Minho had leaned over them both, his finger stroking their daughter's impossibly soft cheek, and when he'd spoken, his voice had been thick with tears. "She's everything. You're everything. Thank you. Thank you for this, for her, for giving me more than I ever dreamed I could have." They'd named her Ji-woo, meaning wisdom and beauty, hoping she'd embody both. From the moment she'd been born, she'd owned them completely. Minho had been a revelation as a father, gentle and patient in ways that had surprised everyone except Naomi. He'd changed diapers without complaint, walked the floors at 3 in the morning when Ji-woo was fussy, sung Korean lullabies in his rough voice until their daughter fell asleep. The first few months had been a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings and the overwhelming love that came with having a child. Naomi had struggled sometimes, with the physical recovery and the hormonal changes and the weight of suddenly being responsible for a life. But Minho had been there through all of it, supporting her, loving her, reminding her that she was doing an amazing job even when she felt like she was failing. Ji-woo had thrived, growing from a tiny newborn into a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everyone and showed early signs of having her father's intense personality. By her first birthday, she was walking and babbling in a mix of Korean and English, and her parents were completely wrapped around her tiny fingers. The party Minho had thrown for her first birthday had been elaborate and excessive, with more guests and presents than one child could possibly need. "You're spoiling her," Naomi had teased, watching him set up yet another elaborate decoration. "She won't even remember this." He'd pulled her close, kissing her temple. "But we will. And I want her to grow up knowing she's loved beyond measure. That we celebrate her existence every day." She'd melted against him, her heart full. "You're a good father. The best father. I'm so glad our daughter has you." He'd looked down at her, his eyes intense. "I'm glad she has you. You've given me everything I never knew I needed. A family, a home, a reason to be better than what I was. I love you, Naomi. More than words can express." She'd kissed him, their daughter's laughter in the background, surrounded by friends and family, and thought that this was what happiness looked like. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and earned and worth every struggle that had brought them here. That evening, after the party had ended and Ji-woo was asleep in her nursery, they'd stood together on the balcony overlooking Seoul, the city glittering below them like it had that first night in the club. "Do you ever think about how we started?" she'd asked, leaning back against his chest. All the time, he'd murmured, his arms tightening around her. How you walked past my office in that green dress and my world shifted. How I saw you on the dance floor and knew I had to have you. How you asked me for everything after your birthday party and I stopped pretending I could ever let you go. She'd turned in his arms to face him. I asked you for sex. I got a husband, a family, a life I never imagined possible. He'd smiled, that rare genuine smile that still made her heart race. You asked me for sex. I gave you forever. Fair trade, I think. She'd laughed, standing on her toes to kiss him. More than fair. Best trade of my life. He deepened the kiss, his hands framing her face. Mine too. Every day for the rest of our lives, mine too. They'd gone back inside eventually, checking on their sleeping daughter one more time before retreating to their bedroom. The passion between them hadn't dimmed with time or parenthood, if anything it had deepened, informed by everything they'd survived together. He'd made love to her that night with the same intensity as always, but now there was an added dimension of gratitude, of awareness of how precious their family was, of how easily it all could have been lost. Afterward, wrapped in sheets and each other, he'd traced patterns on her shoulder. I want another one. She'd looked up at him, surprised. Another baby? Already? Jiwoo is only one. I know. But I love being a father. I love watching you be a mother. I love our family and I want to expand it. Not right away necessarily, but soon. What do you think? She'd considered it, thinking about the sleepless nights and the chaos and the overwhelming joy. I think I want that too. Maybe wait until Jiwoo is 2, give us some time to adjust. But yes, I want more children with you. He'd kissed her forehead, content. Whatever timeline you want. I'm just happy you're open to it. They'd fallen asleep discussing possibilities, names they liked, whether they wanted a boy or another girl, all the hopes and dreams that came with planning a future together. True to their plan, when Jiwoo turned 2, they'd started trying for another baby. It had happened quickly, another pregnancy that had filled them both with joy and anticipation. This time Naomi had known what to expect, had been less anxious and more confident. Minho had been just as protective but slightly less panicked, having survived the first pregnancy and learned that she was stronger than he sometimes gave her credit for. Their son had been born on a spring morning, healthy and loud and perfect. They'd named him Taeyong, meaning son, because he'd brought even more light into their lives. With 2 children, life had become wonderfully chaotic. Jiwoo had adjusted to being a big sister with typical toddler possessiveness, but gradually she'd warmed to her brother, helping with bottles and singing to him when he cried. Minho had juggled his business empire and fatherhood with surprising grace, often working from home so he wouldn't miss moments with his children. Naomi had taken an extended leave from her job, wanting to be present for these early years, and her company had been supportive, understanding that family came first. The years had flowed together after that, marked by milestones and memories and the daily joys of watching their children grow. Jiwoo had started school, excelling in everything she tried, showing signs of having inherited both her parents' determination. Taeyong had been quieter but equally intense, preferring books and drawing to his sister's more active pursuits. They'd complemented each other perfectly, and watching them together had been one of Naomi's greatest joys. Minho had gradually transitioned more of his business toward legitimate ventures, wanting to leave his children a legacy they could be proud of rather than one shadowed by questionable ethics. It had been a slow process, requiring careful maneuvering and the cultivation of new relationships, but he'd been committed to it. For his family, he'd told Naomi, he'd do anything. Including becoming the man his children could look up to without reservation. On their 5th wedding anniversary, he'd surprised her with a weekend away, just the 2 of them while his mother watched the children. They'd gone to a resort on Jeju Island, spending 2 days remembering what it was like to be just a couple rather than parents. They'd made love with the balcony doors open, the sound of waves in the background, and talked about everything and nothing the way they had in the beginning. Are you happy? He'd asked her on the last evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. She'd looked at him, at the man who'd fought for her, protected her, loved her through everything, and her answer had been immediate. Deliriously. Sometimes I can't believe this is my life. That I get to wake up next to you every day. That we have 2 beautiful children. That we survived everything and came out stronger. He'd pulled her close, his lips against her temple. I thank whatever forces brought you to Seoul. To my company. To that club. To me. You saved me, Naomi. From becoming the monster I was trained to be. From a life without meaning or purpose. From myself. She'd turned to kiss him properly. We saved each other. That's what love does. It saves us from the worst versions of ourselves and helps us become who we were meant to be. They'd returned home to find their children had drawn them welcome home pictures, crayon masterpieces that had been hung on the refrigerator with pride. That night, as they'd tucked both kids into bed, listening to their excited chatter about everything they'd done with Grandma, Naomi had felt overwhelmed by gratitude. This life, this family, this love. It was everything she'd never known she'd been searching for. Now, standing in their bedroom 7 years after that first birthday party request, watching Minho get ready for a business dinner, she thought about how far they'd come. From a reckless question and a passionate night to marriage and children and a love that had survived danger and doubt and every test thrown at them. He caught her watching and smiled. What are you thinking about? She moved to him, straightening his tie. That night. My 26th birthday. What I asked you. He pulled her close, his hands settling on her waist. Best question anyone ever asked me. Led to the best night of my life. Which led to 7 years of the best nights of my life. She laughed. You're insatiable. Only for you, he corrected, kissing her softly. Always only for you. Their children's voices drifted from the living room where they were supposedly doing homework but probably watching cartoons. Minho's phone buzzed with a reminder about his dinner meeting. Real life intruded on their moment, as it always did. But that was okay. Because they'd built this life together, messy and complicated and absolutely perfect. From a dangerous attraction to an impossible love to a family that proved sometimes the best things came from the riskiest choices. She'd asked him for one night after her birthday party. He'd given her forever. And every day, in 1,000 small ways and a few monumentally big ones, they chose each other all over again. I love you, she said as he prepared to leave, the words as true now as they'd been that first time. I love you too, he replied, kissing her once more. Hurry home, she called after him. He looked back from the doorway, his eyes holding that same intensity that had captured her in a club 7 years ago. Always. I always come home to you. And he did, just like he always would, for the rest of their lives. Welcome home indeed. 7 years after that birthday party request that had changed everything, Naomi stood in the penthouse bedroom getting ready for another celebration. But this time everything was different. She wasn't the uncertain young woman asking for one night. She was a wife, a mother of 2, a woman who'd been loved so completely she barely remembered what loneliness felt like. Minho appeared in the doorway, and even after 7 years, the sight of him still made her breath catch. He'd aged gracefully, a few lines around his eyes from laughter with their children, his presence somehow even more commanding with the confidence that came from having everything he'd ever wanted. Ready? He asked, moving behind her to help with her necklace, the anniversary gift he'd given her months ago. His fingers brushed her neck, and she shivered despite years of his touch. Some things never changed. Almost. The kids, she asked, meeting his eyes in the mirror. With my mother. We have the whole night. His smile turned predatory, familiar. Just like that first night. She turned to face him, her hands on his chest. That night, I asked you for sex after my birthday party. I thought it would be one night of passion and nothing more. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. And I gave you forever instead. Fair trade? The best trade, she whispered. You gave me a family. A home. A love I didn't know existed. You gave me 2 beautiful children and a life I couldn't have dreamed of. His hands framed her face, thumbs stroking her cheeks. You gave me everything, Naomi. You saved me from becoming the monster I was raised to be. You showed me what it means to love someone more than power, more than control, more than anything. You made me human again. They stood there in the evening light, 7 years of history between them. The dangerous beginning, the kidnapping that had almost destroyed them, the wedding that had made them official, the children who'd completed their family. Every moment had led them here, to this perfect present. I love you, she said, the words as true now as they'd been that first terrifying, exhilarating time. I love you too, he replied. Every day for the rest of our lives. You asked me for one night. I'm giving you forever. They left for dinner hand in hand, the penthouse behind them filled with evidence of the family they'd built. Toys scattered in the living room, children's drawings on the refrigerator, family photos on every surface. A life built from a reckless question and a dangerous man's inability to let her go. As they drove through Seoul's glittering streets, back to the restaurant where he'd first taken her, Naomi realized that sometimes the most dangerous choices led to the most beautiful destinations. She'd asked for sex after her birthday party. He'd given her everything. And that, she thought as he raised her hand to kiss it while waiting at a red light, was the greatest gift of all. From one birthday celebration to 7 years of them. From one night of passion to a lifetime of love. From a question that should have been simple to an answer that changed everything. She'd asked. He'd answered. And neither of them had ever looked back.